Hello everybody, my name is Danny, welcome back to the channel. Today is the day we get to do more Ukraine wall stories as we continue to do it. Today I am not going to do the Slavic accent for the record, I'm just going to go normal. But yes, I sincerely in that recording session just completely without intention naturally slipped into that. I don't know why I did it. It got better and better though over time. So the second episode was actually much better and much more consistent and confident, so I'm very proud of that. But anyway, today, what we are doing is going to be doing Bucha, which Bucha and Mariupol have both been in the news very recently and very heavily spoken about on social media and other things because it's Christmas time. Mariupol is the biggest of these three, and it's completely, well, at least they're showing us via our Western media that it's entirely devastated. I have no idea if it really is or not completely decimated and controlled entirely by Russia or not. But yeah, it looks pretty shit. And obviously, you know, it's Christmas over there now, international dateline and all that. And I'm recording this on the day of Christmas Eve over here, obviously. And they just keep doing it because it has the pictures of it on Christmas and Christmas Eve last year versus it now, obviously, and it's totally different. We did Hostomel last time, so today we're doing Bucha. I have not looked at what Bucha is trending for, but I'm sure it's something similar, unfortunately. The Arrival. Incoming calls from Mom. 3. This will all be over soon, I promise. Mom kept telling me and Vika that for the last few hours. First in Kiev, when we woke up to the sirens. And now, after a 2-hour drive in Bucha. Are you sure they won't manage without you? Vika pleaded, giving Mom a hug. The last in a long time, I thought. I was so proud when Mom joined Kiev's territorial defense just a few months ago, but I was also worried sick. Honey, I have to go back. They'll need qualified doctors there. We can't just let the Russians have our city, can we? It's the sad part of being an adult, Mother smiled. Sad part of having neighbors like that, I grumbled. Mom, do you have to go alone? I could help. I could at least carry ammo. Mom sighed and shook her head. Yarik, this is not a game. I was being serious, though. Katya will take care of you in the meantime, and I will call you every time I can. So keep the phone close by. We all shared a big hug. Vika couldn't hold back tears, and I managed somehow. I was the man of the house now, even if nobody else recognized it. Before leaving, Mom just stood there and looked at us for a long time. She tried to smile so I wouldn't notice her lips quivering. I always notice things like that, but I kept silent. Vika told her she'd take care of me, and I said I'd take care of Vika. Mom laughed through her tears and said Katya would take care of both of us. And then she went speeding away, back to Kiev. Well, it's just us now. Well, it's just us and Katya now. You ready to be babysat? I smiled. Me and Vika didn't always agree, but we were equally confused at the prospect of staying with Katya. She was Mom's local friend, but we didn't know her all that much. She was alright, I guess. Kind, friendly, loved children, or so she said. I was 15, and Vika 2 years my senior, so 17. We didn't need a babysitter. I didn't tell Mom that, though. She seemed to be having a hard enough time already. And I didn't want to make her even more upset. That was our dad's job, even after they divorced. Katarina. Vika, Yarik! I'm so glad your mom brought you here. We will all be safe together, so you thought. But I'll be the judge of that. In the future. Katya pulled us into a tight hug when she showed up, and gave me and Vika a smooch on the forehead each. I tried hard to avoid mine, but failed, well, of course. The rest of the day we spent following the news. Russian airborne repelled in Hostomel. Roadblocks on the way to Kyiv. Zelensky addresses the nation. Russian forces sighted in Chernobyl exclusion zone. Territorial defense issued anti-tank weapons. And in the evening, we could hear the gunfire and explosions in the north again. Russians getting foothold in Hostomel. The popping and cracking of explosions was so loud, it felt like a stray shell might as well land on us. I have to admit, I was anxious listening to it. Mom's reason for leaving us in Bucha was that the northwest would be of no interest to the Russians. Yet, here they are, sinking their teeth into Hostomel. It was probably close enough that I could spy it from the roof. Derek, don't be stupid, Katya said. We should stay in the basement until the shooting stops. Vika must have noticed I wasn't pleased. Hey, it's gonna be fun. Katya brought some board games from home. And some snacks, too. Could we skip to the snacks? I had serious doubts about the board games Katya liked to play. Vika sighed and lowered her voice. Listen, she's freaking out a bit, but she means well. And Mom wants us together, so... Can we just try to keep the peace, please? No. Yes. Everyone's at a tour. So it's good for 2 of them, but this one doesn't have a negative consequence, so I'm gonna go with that. I was proud of my excuse. To call Mom, I'd have to stay upstairs, and since I'd be alone, who would be there to check if the call was over or not? Vika wasn't impressed, I could tell, but she was the dutiful one. This once she'd take one for the team. Yarik, how are you, baby boy? I winced and asked my mom not to call me that, but as we spoke, she did it again, once or twice. I told her there was shooting in Hostomel, but we were probably safe. She was glad. In Kiev, things were a lot more tense. It turned out that the Russians brought saboteurs and recon teams to the city before the invasion, and there was now street fighting in some neighborhoods. That's very predictable in situations like that, if they're smart, because nothing's smart when you do wars, but in war, strategically, if you're smart, you're probably going to do something like that ahead of time, so you can get a foothold, an idea of what to expect. It turned out that the Russians brought saboteurs. I already read that. Guns were being handed out by the truckload. I felt helpless. There my mom was, getting ready for a sleepless night of fighting, all alone, except for the unit she was attached to. I could hear muffled gunfire through the phone. It was distant, but as long as my mom was in Kiev, it was still too close. I sighed. Mom, we're gonna be okay. Watch yourself out there, alright? I promise, baby boy. Tell Katya and your sister I said hi. I went back downstairs, and I did. The first day of the war was coming to a close, but the fighting outside only got harder. Still, we got through one day. How much worse could it get? We were all going to make it. Incoming calls from Mom 5. I always loved war movies and video games, where the characters were fearless, fought against all kinds of adversity, and always won, of course. That's actually why I hate things like that, including superhero movies. They always make the good guys win. It's like, I hate that. Why can't the bad people win for once? You know, like, obviously, real life, you don't want that, but I just want variety and creativity. You know what I'm saying? Something unique. Even if they died, it was only after completing the mission, fulfilling their duty. The real war was different. It was all distant explosions, air raid sirens, and constant fear. And armored vehicles outside our window to remind us that people were dying only a few kilometers away from our house. And this was the so-called rear. The Russians weren't even hitting us directly yet. I tried not to think about how our soldiers on the front line must have felt. My mom was among them. This war wasn't an adventure anymore. That day, Katya decided to go out into the city to look for something. She said she was only leaving for a little while, but then she was gone for almost 2 hours. I could tell Vika was worried, but she tried not to show it. She always did that, just like our mom, and I could always tell it was just an act. By now, me and Vika had gotten a lot friendlier than before. We used to argue a lot, but not so much now. I suppose we were both too scared for our lives to get hung up on little things. Too bad Mom couldn't see us. Maybe it would be a help a bit, knowing we behaved ourselves. Katya came back in a hurry, swinging the door wide open, then shutting it loudly behind her. Her face was white as snow. We could dash towards her. Katya, what happened? What took you so long? Are you okay? Yes, I just need a minute. Her voice was shaking. Katya took a deep breath, then looked me dead in the eye. The Russians are in the city. I saw our soldiers shooting back at them. Me and Vika froze. The war was suddenly much, much closer to us. Our boys are holding them off for now, but the Russians have so many tanks. I saw them. They were firing at the houses. She got up quickly, looking around. I watched her pace around the room, and I really wanted to help calm her down, but I just couldn't see how. I was afraid too. Vika looked as lost as I did. Katya got an idea first. She went to the minibar and got a bottle of wine from it. After some hesitation, she took it to the kitchen. Me and Vika exchanged looks. Katya was obviously in distress, but it was this really good time to drink. I shrugged. If Katya thinks it would help her. Vika pursed her lips, but said nothing. She was always the prim, proper one. Always trying to stay in Mom's good graces. One more reason we often didn't get along. She always sided with adults when they were displeased with me. After all, I was a little boy, and I didn't know any better. It's like she was just trying to rile me up sometimes. So frankly, I didn't mind what Katya was doing. I said from the very beginning, we didn't need a babysitter. We would have managed on our own, but Mom wanted to hear none of it. Katya turned out to be fun though. I guess people called it young at heart. She was more like a friend than a babysitter. Well, that's how parents are supposed to be too, so. The three of us were sort of just living together, and we all felt much safer for it. But it was becoming pretty obvious that Katya was handling the situation even worse than we were. I felt awful about Mom. She wouldn't tell me how things were in Kyiv, and she seemed to she tried to seem calm and confident, but I could see right through her. The whole Kyiv region was getting very dangerous too. Mom couldn't come pick us up, the Russians had almost cut us off, and they fired upon any civilian car they saw. Since February 24th, nobody was ever going to be safe. I was the man of the house. I had to be there for Vika and Katya, but who would be there for Mom? Constant worrying made every day longer than the previous one. Katya didn't drink since the last time, but she talked. She talked a lot. To me, to Vika, to herself. I felt so sorry for her, I couldn't even help her. She talked to me with a blank look. And one day, she started talking about how we were running out of food. With tears in her eyes, she gathered us before the front door. I will go get us food for my house. It will only be a minute. After she gave Vika a smooch on her forehead, I didn't even try to escape mine. Seeing Katya so worried was tearing me to pieces. I'll try to get some sweets too. Candles maybe? Maybe a new board game. Don't worry, it'll only be a minute. She knows better than that, you can tell. It flashed for a minute, I didn't think that was the continuation. We waited for 3 hours, and all the while, the shooting was creeping even closer. Me and Vika sat under one of the stronger walls. The shooting got so bad, I was afraid the house would fold on us like a cheap deck of cards. We held each other, though Vika probably thought she was holding on to me. Big sister and all that. Outside, I could hear the rumbling of a vehicle engine, the tracks rolling over asphalt and the cracking of gunfire. It was all shouting in high-speed death. Bang! Someone slammed into our front door and started knocking on it with their fists. Sergei, Yana, are you guys inside? Please, let me in. I felt Vika's hold tighten around me. I was scared enough as it was, since I recognized the voice. It was Sergi, a local veteran. Yana, please, are you inside? He knew Mom since 2015, when he stitched his head together, as he called it. One of the many soldiers Mom treated over the years. The shouting and the gunfire kept creeping closer. I had to help Sergi, but I also had to take care of Vika if the Russians found us. Really, Vika would actually go down, huh? Surprise. I quickly opened the door, and Sergi stumbled inside. His left sleeve was bloodied, and he was shaking from cold and adrenaline. Between his gasping, ragged breaths, he was letting out steam like a chimney. We barely had time to take him to the basement and hide him under old trash when the door to our house flew open. Our lobby filled up with Russian soldiers, swarthy and bearded ones. Kadrovites, those are the Chechens, right? They didn't carry themselves like military. Most even had their fingers on the triggers. It made the situation all the more terrifying. Their commanders spoke to me in a gravelly voice with a thick accent. Hello. Is anybody else in the house? I shook my head. Vika too. I was terrified. God, if they found Sergi. I don't think we did a good job hiding him. But we were lucky. The soldiers seemed to be in a hurry and barely searched the house. They took our phones, though, and Vika's laptop, and most of our food. But they left after all, and they didn't find Sergi. Thanks, kids, he said when Vika brought him water. His voice was raspy and coarse. When you call your mom, tell her that she's an amazing woman. Raised you like fucking lions. Vika gasped at his language. He covered his mouth and grinned. Hey, weren't you staying with Katya Oleshko? He did not like the news when we told him. Damn. And you don't have phones, right? Your mom would be worried sick. He told us that his territorial defense unit was all but destroyed. Nobody expected an attack from the north. Some managed to fall back into Irpin, while Sergi and some others stayed behind to provide cover. Now, he intended to lie low for a while, but fuckers came to my house. Pardon my French. Didn't seem random. They must have gotten a list of local veterans somewhere. When I offered him to stay with us, he refused out of hand. No way. You've done much more than enough, buddy. If you need help, come find my place at the garages. I'll help however I can. Later that day, I heard more movement outside. Afraid the Russians have returned, I peeked outside through the corner of a curtain. In the twilight, I could make out at least 24 armed figures, and a short, stocky man with them, and warm black pants, and an expensive winter jacket. We've been to this one already. Just some kids shitting themselves in fear. Who did you say lives here? I cursed silently at the stocky man. I knew exactly who he was. Alexander Hursky. He was pretty infamous around town. A former deputy at the parliament, he worshipped Russia, and he had an ego the size of the moon, but I never expected this. Some no-name doctor. Forget about it. The stocky man waved his hand, then clapped his hands. Come on, we've got no more Nazis to chase down. I know all the addresses. Missed calls from Mom, 12. It's been several days since the Russians entered Bucha. Katya still hasn't returned. Time slowed down to a crawl. I kept feeling like Katya was going to open the front door, walk in, and tell us something reassuring. Some good news worth waiting for. The door wouldn't open, though. But maybe that was a good thing, considering the noises coming from the street. Every day there was shooting outside. Sometimes we heard someone crying or screaming in the distance, and more vehicles marked with white Z passed our houses every day. But their passing wasn't as scary as when they stopped. It meant they wanted something, and they could come inside our house and get it. The sorts of things that worried me before seem stupid now. Grades, arguing with Vika, Mom being mad at me? I was such a child. I wouldn't mind rolling back the time and being a little child again. But Katya was still missing. I had to do something. Her house was on the neighboring street. Barely a 2-minute walk, but Vika hated the idea. Yarik, you don't even think about it. It's too dangerous over there. I rolled my eyes. Vika, the city is occupied by the Russians. It's dangerous everywhere. And Katya was supposed to come back forever ago. What if she needs help? Her house is the first place to look. Then I'll go. Vika grabbed my backpack straps. You stay home. They said on the news that Russians are killing all men they can find. You'll be taking a risk too. Don't you know what happens to girls during the war? Vika shuddered. She didn't let go of the strap though. Why was she always treating me like a child? I would definitely go together. Yeah, like there's not even a fucking question. We'll go together. If we're both so worried, let's just go. We'll feel safer, and if something happens, we'll be able to count on each other. After some hesitation, Vika agreed. Okay, let's do it like that. She smiled a little. When did you learn to compromise? This is an emergency. We can keep on arguing when the war ends. Our bravado was gone the moment we stepped outside. The city seemed deserted. No cars, no passerbys, only heaps of trash, debris, and houses with their doors bashed in. I felt like we were stuck in some post-apocalyptic movie. We counted 8 bodies by the time I reached Katya's house. All men, all with gunshot wounds. This wasn't supposed to happen to civilians. I could understand dying to a stray shell, or during a bombing, but these people didn't look like they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their hands were tied behind their backs. The sight of Katya's house stopped us dead in our tracks. The door was broken down. We slowly peeked inside. The house was ravaged. Furniture turned over. The chandelier shattered. Even the fridge was on the floor. The floor was littered with broken glass, discarded food packs, empty bottles, and dirty boot prints. And Katya was lying in the middle of it all. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing. Vika hugged me and looked away, while I just stood there, taking deep breaths and trying to calm us both down. Katya was without clothes, battered, covered in bruises, looking up at the ceiling with wide-open, unseeing eyes. There was a lot of dark blood, old and dried by now, which is why it was dark. A large pool of it was under Katya's head, and nearby I saw a pistol shell casing. We walked home in a haze. We came back completely lost, but at least we still had each other. It lessened the impact a little bit. Still, that evening we didn't talk even once. Missed calls from Mom 26. It's been several days since we found out about Katya. The situation in the city remained the same, though there were fewer shots to be heard. We could still hear loud explosions in the distance. Our only reminder that somewhere out there was our army still fighting the invasion. There was no electricity, no heating, and we had no way to reach Mom by the phone. And March was cold this year. We kept our winter jackets on. And neither of us could cook over the fire, and if we could, we still have no firewood. We ended up mostly eating packaged foods. Not getting any news was tough on us. We lived in a vacuum, and knew nothing about the world beyond Bucha. Where was the front line now? Would NATO states intervene? Intervenary? And when would you finally be free again? I couldn't stop thinking about Mom. Only now could I realize how much she mattered and how much our brief calls used to help. I'd give anything again to hear Mom's voice. I wonder how things were for her. She must have been out of her mind with worry. Deep inside, I felt guilt because I didn't call enough. I didn't reassure her, didn't behave as well as I could. I just didn't value her enough. One morning, me and Vika were woken up by noise coming from the street. We could hear the engines roaring, orders being given, and muffled chatter of some soldiers. We didn't risk approaching the windows, but I heard the Russians mention a rotation several times. Here we go. My voice still wants to, or instinctually I still want to do more Slavic. So like every once in a while, that's why I stumble on words, is because I'm slowly starting to go back to Slavic again while also semi-subconsciously fighting it. It's kind of weird. And that very day's evening, our door was bashed open. 3 Russian soldiers entered the house. Me and Vika jumped to our feet, staring at them. The Russians scanned the building, then turned to us. They were all armed. One of them, with a sergeant's insignia, was leering at Vika. "Hello, we are here to inspect this house." He looked around. "Does anybody live here? Any adults?" I was so afraid I felt sick, so I just shook my head. The 3 Russians quickly searched the house. When they returned to the living room, the sergeant sat down on the sofa and looked around some more. Not searching anymore, but appraising. He clicked his tongue at our flat screen. "What the house? I think it'll stay a while." Our worst fears were coming true. Me and Vika exchanged frightened looks. "Something wrong? Got your tongues." "Cheer the hell up. We saved you from Nazis." "You?" He leered at Vika again. "Aren't you grateful?" Vika shuddered and backed away until she bumped into the wall. "I don't think these 2 appreciate us being here." The sergeant gestured for his men. "Get the girl for questioning." Obviously I do that. Couldn't let them hurt my sister. If they shot me, so be it. But I just couldn't. Leave her alone. I tried to tackle one of the soldiers, but he just punched me right in my face. My head hurt and stung, and the room began to reel. I heard Vika scream, "Please don't hurt him." After another punch, I fell to the ground. I tried to get up immediately and got the kick to the gut. Then another one, and again, and again. Vika was desperate, screaming at them to leave me alone. "You behave yourself or I'll fucking strangle both of you." They stopped hitting me and I could finally breathe in. Tried to get up, but my arms and legs were too weak. And the Russians dragged Vika into a room nearby. The door slammed shut, muffling her pleas. I saw nothing, but I heard the sounds. I knew what was happening behind that door. I thought I was going crazy. Vika's screams were burrowing into my brain. I refused to believe this was happening. Stuck in the far corner, I covered my ears and sat whimpering, trying to ignore the sounds coming from the room. Eventually, Vika went quiet. I could only hear her crying. And then, I couldn't even hear that. I don't know how long it lasted, but by the time the door opened again, I wasn't thinking clearly. The Russians ignored me as they went around the house, grabbing whatever they liked. My mouse suddenly is not moving in the game, and I think it crashed. Did it? What the hell just happened? Oh, that was weird, and I've never had that happen before. The Russians ignored me as they went around grabbing whatever they liked. "Sergeant, maybe let's take the girl to the headquarters. We don't have to walk all the way here again." Sergeant shrugged. "Fine by me, but we'll put her with the rest of the camp followers." The Russians laughed. One of them went back to the bedroom and brought out Vika. She was unconscious. They left and took Vika away from me. I couldn't hold back tears any longer. I didn't expect that to happen. Yursky. This guy. Right. "Hey boy, what do you need? Where are your parents?" Yursky was confused but surprisingly friendly. I came to ask for help with Vika because I knew Yursky talked to the Russians. As a Kiesling, he must have had their trust. A long shot, but the only one I had. I'd gotten very little sleep in the previous days. An hour here, an hour there, only because I was too exhausted. Exhausted by looking for things I could do, realizing how helpless I was. I wanted to see Mom. I wanted to hug her and never let her go. Instead, I came to speak with Yursky, that excuse of a human. Words didn't come easy, but I told him what the Russians did, and where they took Vika, and how I just had to climb the house to see the place. Damn it. He bit his lip. Looked around. I don't know what he was afraid of. Wasn't he working with the Russians? You'll freeze to death out there. Come on in. We'll talk inside. He got me a warm blanket and put up a kettle. The town had no electricity, but he had a generator and the Russians let him keep some gas for it. He asked me for my story again and wanted to know every detail, but not to help me, as it turned out. Well, who would have thought? This doesn't add up. The Russian army is only here for the nationalists. Besides, a Russian soldier wouldn't hurt a child. Are you sure they didn't take your sister in for questioning? I wanted to throw up. I know what I saw, I said, squeezing my fists. Stupid bastard, looking me in the eye and saying things like that. They had their way with her, and they took her with them. And they're doing God knows what to her over there. But Russians aren't like that. Now, Americans see. Now they would. Have you seen what they did to Americans? Have you seen what the Americans did to Iraq? Have you seen what the U.S. has done to literally every place they've been? They've taken part in the genocide of millions of people in Chile in the 70s, while alongside of the installed dictator that they installed in Pinochet. They decimated Iraq. They've directly contributed, alongside Israel, to the decimation of Syria. They've decimated Yemen, alongside Saudi Arabia. They fuck every place up that they go. That's the name of the game. Destabilization. That's the entire fucking point. Same with Afghanistan. Vietnam, also 70s. That was the worst of the worst, arguably, just because of the fact that it wasn't just napalm and everything else, and like completely innocent people that were out in the villages of Vietnam. They were just minding their own businesses. They weren't participating in the wars at all. They're just leading their lives, and they not only got murdered via obviously the US troops, they also got tortured, raped, and beyond that. And on top of that, they got napalmed, so their skin is literally melting off their bodies. And they were just told to never talk about it, never mention that they were doing that. And also, they were thus, the soldiers themselves also directly lied to the entire time. Which is why the most fucked up soldiers in US history are still the Vietnamese ones, the Vietnam War vets, because man did to fuck them up. I had a family member, of course he's passed now, that was in the Vietnam War. And his entire life got fucked into the fucking stratosphere of Jupiter. It was just like, he got so messed up by it. What everything was doing, all the lies and everything, and yeah, this is so much. Yeah, so no. But you know that other major nations, like Russia, are going to do the same shit. That's what they do. They don't have a fuck to give. I wanted to scream every second I wasted with him. Vika was suffering. But I had to persevere. The Russians wouldn't keep her for long, and they would not escape unpunished. Meanwhile, Yursky continued. A Russian officer's honor, you can't even begin to understand. You are too young. They won't move a hair on your sister's head. Burn in hell. Yes, they will. I want my sister back. If they are such nice people, why are they holding her? I needed to convince him somehow and quickly. I still feel like, yes, that would be a good shot in the dark, but I'm definitely going to do that, at the very least. A Russian officer's honor. What about this? I lifted up my shirt and showed Hiroshiki my stomach, all blue and sickly yellow with bruises. Who do you think did this? He was genuinely thrown. Oh my, who did that to you? I could not believe my ears. The Russians did. I've been telling you for the last hour or so. His eyes glazed over, and we sat in silence for a while. I know an officer. A new one, after rotation. I will talk to him. Invite him for some drinks tonight. Maybe when they're in a good mood. I'm sure this was a misunderstanding. I didn't want to believe he spent as long as I did occupied Bucha, yet stayed so ignorant. But as long as he was going to speak with the Russians, my visit wasn't entirely useless. I'd be a fool to trust Hirsky's word, though. Instead of going home, I set up in a ruined house across the street. I needed to see the meeting happen. Very soon, Hirsky went somewhere, and returned accompanied by several soldiers. He invited them in, then made a funny face when they didn't bother wiping their boots on the doormat. Perhaps if he himself lied down, they'd be more willing. I left my hiding spot and skulked closer to the house for a better view. The soldiers he invited set up in the kitchen, and Hirsky brought out the glasses and a bottle of russet drink. Then, another, when the soldiers called him a cheapskate. Once the drinks began flowing, the Russians did loosen up. So what did you want to talk about? You want to town for yourself? The officer chuckled. Become administrator. The rest of the soldiers laughed, calling Hirsky a Galitar. No. Though the locals are already bringing their complaints to me. He didn't mention me by name, but he told my soldiers my story. He was proud to do so. He probably expected them to immediately debunk it. The Russian officer just smiled and exchanged a quick glance with the soldiers. Hirsky, mind your own business, you fat fuck. Okay? You were doing so well. Hirsky's eyes went wide with rage. I am old enough to be your father! How dare you speak to me like that? Blam! A bright flash, a shell casing plinking off the kitchen table, and the thud of a collapsing body. I froze in place with my eyes closed, my heart thumping in my ears, sucking in air so I wouldn't suffocate. Oh, come on! Indoors, my ears are ringing. Fuck. Didn't anybody catch where he got the booze from? One of the doors, right? I backed away from the window, then through the ruined fence. Then I ran. He's called Mom 70. I kept thinking about Vika for the next few days. I knew I couldn't negotiate with the Russians. Hirsky tried already. They killed a man who spent his whole life promoting their Russian world. What would they do to me? And one day, I overheard some people talking as they cooked breakfast over a campfire. Soon, there was to be an evacuation from Bucha. I imagined myself leaving the nightmare I was trapped in for the last few weeks. I could see Mom coming to meet me. I could see myself finally falling asleep without worrying if I'll wake up, if it was just something to strive for. But Vika... You wanted to be a grown-up, Yark. Here's your grown-up choice. And nobody to ask for guidance. I was getting swarmed by memories of Vika. Helping me with homework, supporting me when we found out Mom and Dad had divorced. Always caring, always kind. What was I supposed to do? I'm gonna try it. Siarki. The longer I thought, the more I realized. I couldn't help or leave Vika alone. I couldn't help Vika alone. Well, no, actually that works. I had to find her and I had to break her out. Even if it would be the last thing I did in my life. Then I remembered, I wasn't alone in this. Serhiy, the veteran we hid from the Russians, could still be alive. He'd know what to do a lot better than I did. This gave me some much needed strength. I was a 15-year-old kid, but Serhiy was a trained soldier. The Russians were in for a surprise. I reached Serhiy's garage by sneaking through nooks and crannies, staying out of sight. My enthusiasm had faded by then. What if Serhi wasn't even alive anymore? And what if he refused to help? I knew saving Vika was pretty much suicide. Anxious, I reached the garage Serhi described and carefully knocked on the middle door. Serhi, it's Yarik Kravchenko. Please, let me in. There's movement inside. The door opened ever so slightly. Are you alone? Yes. The Russians took Vika. I need help freeing her. With a very heavy sigh, Serhi opened the door and let me in. Inside, I saw an improvised barricade made of a metal table, tires, and boxes. Serhi was on edge, I could tell. He held a Soviet Stechkin? Soviet Stechkin pistol in one hand and a grenade in the other. He pointed at the free chair. Sit. Tell me your whole story. Stuttering, I told him the day Vika was taken. Serhi was silent, letting me talk. When I asked him to help rescue her, he looked me in the eye. Yarik, do you understand that she might be dead already? Do you want to risk it? There is an evacuation going on. You should leave. That way your mom won't have to bury both of her children. I knew he was right. Our chances were slim. But I could not leave without trying it first. If this was your sister, would you have left? Could you live with it? He mulled it over for a long time. Finally, he nodded. Fine. Can you shoot? I nodded, unsure. I've been to a firing range a couple of times. That had to count, right? After some hesitation, Serhi gave me an unloaded Makarov. Here's what we'll do. It took us a couple of days of watching the Russian HQ to come up with a plan. We knew which house Vika was held in and how many Russians were guarding it. We just needed a plan to distract them. Luckily, Serhi had some ideas. When everything was ready, we decided to act. The night was moonless. Lucky for us. I hid close to the Russians' HQ in the shadows behind the overflowing trash containers. Serhi was supposed to draw out the Russians so that I could sneak in and free Vika. A car engine started somewhere in the dark. Serhi began his distraction. 2 soldiers walked out of the house. Shots rang out, and they fell. Someone inside the house started shouting. The Russians poured out into the street. One of them dropped dead immediately. The rest dispersed and took cover. They were firing in every direction. This was my time to act. I quickly reached the back entrance of the house and got inside. I went room by room, clutching the Makarov in my sweaty hands, searching for my sister. Outside, the gunfire continued. When I finally found her, I wanted to scream with joy. There Vika was, upright on the bed, pale and exhausted, but alive. She just stared at me. Eric, is that you? Vika, we are leaving. Without waiting, I grabbed her by the hand and took off. We got outside the way I came in. A Russian showed up from behind the corner and took aim immediately. Before I could react, a gunshot. It was Serhi. Run! Get out of here! A run we did. I heard Serhi's handgun go off a few more times, then a burst of assault rifle fire, and then silence. Then a loud bang. I remembered Serhi had a grenade on him, and I thanked for everything. We dipped into an alleyway and came face to face with another Russian soldier. He was startled, but managed to grab Vika as she ran. She screamed. I tackled him to the ground immediately. Vika, go! Thank God she listened, because I wasn't going anywhere now. When I tried to get up, the Russian pulled me back down and pushed me into the ground. The last thing I remembered was Vika's silhouette vanishing in the distance. Then, a hit across the back of my head and darkness. Missed calls from Mom, 120. I woke up. My eyes hurt at first, but I could hear and smell things again. And the place I was in smelled terrible. Like sweat, vomit, and human waste. I opened my eyes to look around. Bad idea. I was on a dirty mattress inside a dark and cramped room with no windows. The only light source was a dim light bulb over a heavy metal door. And I wasn't the only one in the room. There were about 10 men in total here. Different ages and clothing, some in camouflage, some in jeans, even in tracksuits. It felt like a completely random gathering of people, but they all had something in common. They were all beaten up. Some were unmoving, others talked quietly among themselves. Nobody noticed me. I tried to sit up. My head was spinning at first, but ultimately I think I wasn't as hurt as I had once thought. I wanted to ask if anyone knew where we were when the door creaked open. 2 Russians walked in. They brought a man in a bloodied shirt with them and threw him on the floor. He didn't move. Only his ragged, raspy breathing indicated he was still alive. Meanwhile, the soldiers grabbed another prisoner, a gaunt, middle-aged man, and dragged him towards the exit. He did not resist. I think he knew it was futile. The door closed with a metal clang. A few minutes later, there was already screaming from behind it. Sometimes it was broken up by loud swearing and muffled sounds of punching. The realization made me sweat. The Russians detained me in one of their basements. After 8 years of war, everybody knew what a Russian basement meant. A torture chamber. Oh, so like the CIA. Neat. Russian patsies. I almost said pasties. Russian pastries. Russian patsies and Donbass. Russian patsies and Donbass put everyone they didn't like into those basements, from political activists to uncooperative civilians. And sometimes it was just a way to force someone to part with his business. All kinds of things happened in those basements: torture, humiliations, and executions. And now I found myself in the basement too. I shuddered from every yelp coming from behind the door. Eventually they got quieter and quieter. Soon there was no sound at all, at least for a while. Then a deafening bang, a point-blank gunshot. I was shaking. The guy who came before me was already beaten to a pulp, then finished off. This couldn't be happening, not in the 21st century. Then the door opened again, and now Russians were looking at me. They grabbed me and dragged me towards the exit. I was paralyzed with fear. I'd never felt sheer terror like that in my life. I was too scared to fight back, and what could I do against armed soldiers? For a moment, I even thought they could go easy on me if I told them what they wanted to hear. Of course, that was a silly thing to hope for. They would only go easy on me if they chose to do so. They dragged me into a very small room, not unlike the previous one, except a chair standing in the middle, and on the hallway nearby, blood splatter, so fresh it was still bright red and wet. The soldiers tied me to the chair, stood by the entrance. Another Russian entered, an officer. He seemed completely indifferent. That was until he saw me. If it ain't our hero, we're going to have a little talk. Find out who you are and where you are from. He slowly circled around me, then jabbed me in the chest. I doubled over, coughing and trying to draw a breath. My eyes got wet. We'll be here a long time, buddy. We'll be here a long time, buddy. You tell me everything. By the time I am done, you'll sell out your mother just so I'd stop. The Russian started asking questions, and I had no answers for, about Nazis, partisans, the Ukrainian military and checkpoints. And when I told him I knew nothing, he hit me again and again. He must have thought I was lying, and he didn't like it at all. I held out for some time, but with every new hit, my resolve faded. Then, instead of using his fists, the Russian took a metal rod. 2 crushed fingers was all I could take. I talked. But I didn't tell the Russian what he wanted to hear. I remembered Vika, I remembered Katya, and everything those Russians have done to us. I sent the interrogator the way of the Russian warship. No more questions after that, but they couldn't silence me either. I talked about their mothers, their children, their government, And them, and their way of life too. It felt good despite all the pain. But by then I had nothing to lose. I didn't know how long it lasted, but it felt like forever. I lost consciousness several times, but they'd wake me up by dumping cold water over me. Then it would start all over again. I felt like bleeding minced meat. The pain got so bad. Eventually I checked out and couldn't hear questions anymore. When I lost consciousness again, they dragged me back to the cell. I woke up in the same dirty mattress as before. By now, that mattress felt like home. I was convinced the basement would be the last thing I would ever see. But I was wrong. 154. The bag on my head smelled like rust. It was damp on the outside, and my head was pounding, coming apart. There used to be a warm trickle down my temple and the side of my neck, but it's long since dried up. I couldn't stop shaking. Some hero I turned out to be. Back in the basement, the Russians came in and put everyone on their feet. They blindfolded us with some scotch tape and told us to move. Up the stairs, into the yard, towards the rumbling engine of a truck. Probably a gauze. They were putting us on a truck. That's when my legs gave out. I couldn't walk. I knew how this was going to end. I've heard the stories. Either they drive us forward to their meat shields, or ship us to Belarus, Vytorosha, as prisoners, or somebody nearby started pleading. Don't do this. You don't have to do this. I didn't do anything. You don't have to do this. They didn't have to do any of it, but they chose to, so I told myself I wouldn't beg. I was the man of the house. I wouldn't beg. But my legs gave out all the same. The Russians threw me in a truck anyway, and someone fell on top of me, and all I could smell was sweat, rust, and vomit. I was choking back tears. My mind went to Vika, and I just hoped she was all right, even if I failed to do enough. I was in a haze when the truck finally stopped. They pulled us to the ground like we were crates. My arm exploded with pain, but it was dulled. If I cracked a bone, it barely registered. That's adrenaline for you. Get up, look! Wherever I was, whenever I was too slow, I got a prod or a kick for it. We didn't walk for too long. Eventually, they put us on our knees. Then we heard shovels. Someone among us spat on the ground. Into the line. Is it just local? Yeah. Someone next to me gulped loudly. Someone else swore under his breath, cursing the Russians. Someone, with a calm, old man's voice, started to pray. I expected there to be more begging, more tears, and a deep part of me was glad there wasn't. But I think adults simply knew too well how this was going to end. I'm not sure I knew. I wasn't an adult yet. I just really didn't want to die. And then the sound of the shoveling stopped. No. I feel like this is a guarantee to get yourself shot anyway and killed. That would just end it automatically. This has a chance for timing, depending on where you are in the execution lineup, to allow you to potentially, or this to be stopped and you to have a chance to escape later. This, I guess, in a way could too, but I'm just scared this will automatically end it. Whereas these might not. Although it might all just auto end. I don't know. I'm gonna go with my first instinct anyway. Couldn't see anything, but I didn't need to. I heard where the shovels were, so I sprang to my feet and ran the opposite direction. There was frenzied shouting behind me. Drop him, someone! I kept running even as bullets whizzed right past me through the air. I ran and ran until I could hear the Russians no more. I made it. The bindings on my hands became loose and I slipped them off. I tore the scotch tape off my face and I could finally see again. I found Vika at our house, cold and scared, but alive. She managed to escape while the Russians were dealing with me. We had little food, but I'd let her have all of it so she could rest and regain some strength. I knew Bucha well enough that we could stealthily escape to Kiev. It would take us a day, maybe two. There, we'd find Mom. Hopefully, I could and would convince her to leave the military and never leave me and Vika alone again. But that's not what happened. I barely made it 10 meters when a short burst of shots rang out, and something stung me in the back. I fell from the force of it. There was a terrible burn in my chest, and I gasped for air, but no air came. I started to choke and cough. I lied in the darkness, wheezing and gurgling. My arms and legs became weak, and I couldn't even try to escape. All I wanted at that moment was a small breath of air. For fuck's sake, finish him already! See you on Monday. Vika got up from the cot and slowly walked towards the exit. In the hospital's hallway, a woman in military uniform was waiting for her. How are you, darling? She tried to hug her daughter, but stopped when she noticed her shiver ever so briefly. Vika tried to smile. It's fine, Mom. Her voice was quiet and lifeless. She quickly took a small backpack from the uniformed woman and hurried towards the exits, the woman's side. What is going on? The woman's side. Nothing was ever going to be fine, and Yana knew it. Not after everything her daughter survived under the Russian occupation, and not after Yarek. Yana closed her eyes, holding back tears. Now wasn't the time. She had to stay strong for Vika, so that Yarek's sacrifice was not in vain. Yarek, so kind and brave and full of energy, he always had so many plans and ideas. Yana hurried after her daughter. She had to take care of her. Her rehabilitation was not going well. Vika barely talked and could only sleep under sedatives. Otherwise, the nightmares got way too intense. Vika never told her the nightmares were about, but Yana could piece it together from the things she muttered in her sleep. At night, Vika returned to the house she used to be kept in. Sometimes it looked like she was there, even during the day. And it wasn't only because of Yana that her children even ended up in Bucha, far from the war. Looking at her daughter, the woman's side, there was almost no hope Vika would completely recover. As a doctor, she understood that much. But as a mother, she kept hoping for the best. And they haven't even talked about the possible pregnancy. Yana still couldn't find the right time for that talk or the right words. Vika was found a week after Bucha was liberated. Thanks to Yarek, she escaped the Russian troops and hid in abandoned houses until the Ukrainian army entered the city. At first, Yana could barely recognize her daughter. Gaunt, scared of every noise, Vika was a pale shadow of the blooming young daughter Yana remembered. She was put in a hospital, and Yana spent all of her time by Vika's side. She hoped her presence would help Vika recover faster. So far, it did not seem to make a difference. They found Yarek in a mass grave. There were other men with him. The oldest one over 60, the youngest Yarek barely 16. It was just one of hundreds of such graves found in the Kiev region. Only now Yana realized how much of a man Yarek was. He was every bit the grown-up he claimed to be. What a fool she was, treating him like a child. She wanted to tell him as much, wanted to hug him, look him in the eye, tell him she was sorry for abandoning him and Vika. But all she could give her son now was a proper funeral. Yarek had found his final rest on a small cemetery organized for the victims of Bucha. The rows of freshly dug graves seemed endless to Yana, and all she could do was hear the crying of all those who gathered here. She was there to bury her son, and staring at his peaceful face in the coffin, she couldn't believe her eyes. She wished Yarek would open his eyes, smile, and tell her he was okay. This is all a big misunderstanding, which she wouldn't give for that to be the truth. Vika stood next to her and couldn't stop sobbing. Whatever Yana told her, she kept blaming herself. She always looked at after him, even if they argued as children do. Yarek's death was a heavier blow to her than everything else she suffered at the hands of the Russians. At first, Vika even refused to eat because of it. Only Yana's pleas made her relent. If she starved herself out of grief, Yarek's sacrifice would be meaningless. Yana gave her daughter a tight hug. There used to be 3 of them, Yana, Vika, and Yarek, all together against the world. Now, there was only 2. Maybe one day they would get used to it, unlikely as that seemed. Bucha was amongst the first towns hit by the Russian troops when the Russian invasion of Ukraine began on February 24, 2022. After a week of fighting, the Russians captured Bucha on March 5th, 2022, and were only fully beaten back on March 31st, 2022. What took place during the Russian occupation is now considered a genocide. As of June, 412 dead had been confirmed, buried in mass graves or left in the streets. According to the local authorities, more than 85% of the victims died from gunshot wounds, suggesting the killings were deliberate and intentional. Crimes against the civilian population included summary execution, torture, looting, and rape. Evidence suggests that children were not spared. Bucha became emblematic of the Russian occupation, but it is far from the only town where genocide took place. As of June 2022, on the Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine, including the cities of Kherson and Mariupol, violence continued unabated. The end of the war is not in sight. I like that one hits so much deeper than the last one. It's almost hard to form words. Like, even right now, I actually shake a little bit because it's just like I shudder and stuff every once in a while because, you know, you don't have to experience something like that to know what it'd be like. You can feel it with every fiber of your being. Emotionally, you can feel the trauma, and your brain doesn't hold back from imagination. Like, you can feel, picture, live it, especially when you have as boundless and hyperactive imagination as I do. So you don't have to go through it to know it. So it's so fucking heavy. But yeah, this game is actually based off of, you know, reality. It's based off of real life and these cities and towns, and based off of genuinely true stories from these towns and cities during the Russian-Ukraine war. So yes, it's a game. Yes, it's choose your own adventure. And yes, the stories themselves, I think specifically, if I recall correctly, are obviously the things that are technically fiction. They just heavily take from real people's stories, and then build off of that. So it's just crazy. Man, that actually hit me way deeper and harder than I thought it would. By the end of that, I was actually really struggling, straining myself to get through it. Not gonna lie, but yeah. This game is free, by the way, on Steam. This is really a chore to do anything. I don't even think I'm gonna give this an outro because it wouldn't feel right. So yeah, this game is free on Steam. So if you want to get to know some of the stories, they have 3, you know, storylines, the 3 cities in this, which is Mariupol, Bucha, and Hostomel. You can get it for free on Steam. Just obviously look up the game's name and you'll be able to access it, or go into the description and I link the game there. But yeah, like I said, there's not even going to be a proper outro for this because it just wouldn't be right. It would not sit right with me to do that, so. Because I'm already struggling in the first place at the end of this, so. Stay safe out there as you can, and maybe I'll see you in the next video.